Last week I had the opportunity, along with a delegation of other elected officials, to travel halfway across the globe and spend a very limited amount of time on the clock, something in the vicinity of about 55 hours in the State of Israel. The trip was sponsored by Westchester Jewish Council and UJA, and it involved a number of other elected officials, State Assemblywoman Amy Paulin, Board Chairman, Board of Legislators Chairman Vedat Gashi, the Minority Leader Margaret Kunzio was on the delegation, and the Majority Whip Tyree Woodson Samuels was on the trip, all three county legislators, and then joined by three municipal officials from New Rochelle, White Plains, and Greenburgh, along with a couple of other individuals from the organizations. We spent really a whirlwind time doing a number of different things. We had the opportunity to hear from some of the families who are still waiting for their family members to be released. They're being held hostage by Hamas, and they had a press conference in Tel Aviv, which was highly emotional. We watched the press conference and participated in the press conference. Had the opportunity to go to Hadassah Hospital and talk to a couple of the individuals who were injured, wounded during the fighting at some of the kibbutzes in the southern part of Israel on the border of Gaza, and how they reacted to the circumstances of what they were facing. We went to a distribution center that is trying to collect voluntary materials to help those families who are now displaced. Many of the residential areas that are near Gaza have now been emptied out, and even where people weren't injured or taken captive, that they've moved to hotels in the Jerusalem and Tel Aviv area to protect themselves from whatever might happen going forward. And as would be any other individual that's displaced, they have nothing. They're living in a hotel for some extended period of time, and there's an effort made to help those individuals. I had the opportunity to briefly meet and talk with the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. Now, the President of Israel is not the head of the government. The Prime Minister is. We did not meet with the Prime Minister, but we met with the sort of head of state, the symbolic head of the Israeli legislative process and government. We chatted for a few minutes. We also met with the opposition leader, a gentleman by the name of Yair Lapid, who briefly served as prime minister last year during a series of political turmoil issues that are happening in Israel, and he is probably going to compete for the prime ministership in the future, heading the party Yesh Atid. And we talked, candidly about what was happening in Israel. We spoke from the position not as individuals who are responsible for foreign policy from the United States of America, but as interested public officials to understand what was happening there and how it was happening there. We talked with a number of other individuals in the comings and goings that we have. No one invited us to cross over into Gaza or the West Bank. So we stayed where we were welcomed and invited, and we had the chance to speak to people. I viewed this overall as part of a huge jigsaw puzzle, and the problems of the Middle East have been going on for thousands of years. They will go on well after my time on this planet is over. The difficulties of trying to parse what the role of the United States should be in these things really belongs to the President of the United States and his chief executive support, and Secretary of State and others, Secretary of Defense, and also by the members of the Congress of the United States. But in the same way that we here in the county government, I have certain responsibilities as county executive, and the Board of Legislators has a certain check and balance, so too does the Congress have a voice and a check and a balance. But the decisions are made by the President of the United States and his team, and we can only have one foreign policy at a time. You can critique it, you can agree, disagree, and when election day comes, you can vote to change the people that are in office. But at this stage of the game, President Biden and his team has a certain policy of how they're dealing with Israel. I'm well aware of the protests that are going on. I know that there's different points of view, and even the terminology between these different groups. You fight over words because one word signifies something that has a certain value attached to it if you use that word and not another word. And we're hearing words tossed around like genocide and apartheid to try to help frame the issue in a certain light that one group has or another. The single most moving part of the trip for me, and I remind those who don't know that I'm Roman Catholic, a Christian. So I'm there with a sense of connection as a person who's aware of what's happening in the world, and as a person who in this jurisdiction deals with many of our neighbors and friends who are Jewish and have a great emotional attachment to Israel, and an attachment that is a deep bond, and in many ways the same bond that I have through my heritage to the land of Ireland and the land of Italy. I did not grow up in either Italy or Ireland. My forebears did, and that means something to me. And when I see the turmoil in the Middle East, I do have a relationship to that, and that is how I felt about the troubles in Northern Ireland when those things were happening, and there was terrorist attacks on both sides of the Catholic and the Protestant side. And I would read in the newspaper about how Catholic children or Catholic men were killed, and then on the other side, how Protestant men were killed, and the atrocities on both sides that reflected terrorism on both sides of that issue. Ultimately, I'm gratified to know that now there's been peace in Northern Ireland, that those who are dead cannot be brought back to life. My great-grandfather and my grandfather were both born in Northern Ireland, County Fermanagh, one of the 6 northern counties. It is never easy to be a Catholic in Northern Ireland, but today we have peace. We have a cessation of terrorism and a cessation of war, and a 2-state solution, where Northern Ireland is operated differently from the Republic of Ireland, which are the 26 counties in the southern and central part of Ireland. We're not here to talk about Ireland. We're here to talk about the Middle East and the battle between Israel and Hamas as they're placed in the Gaza area, and what the role of the Palestinian population is, and what are the role of the populations around it, in what situation Lebanon is in, which had a civil war. And ultimately, Hezbollah, which is an affiliated entity with Iran, has won out and now rules Lebanon, and what's happened in Syria, what's happened in Iran and Iraq and all these other countries that are in proximity. Most moving part of the trip is when we went down to kibbutz Kfar Aza, and that is a kibbutz which is not far from the Gaza border. I had not seen a kibbutz, and I had a prior trip, 2 prior trips to Israel. The best way I could describe it to my friends is I felt like I was going into a townhome complex where there are lots of different residential areas, and they sort of have common area with it. And when I went to this particular kibbutz, this was a kibbutz that was attacked on the morning of October 7th. And the signs of that attack were everywhere. There was devastation that, to me, looked as close to what it would look like if a hurricane or a tornado had gone through a complex. The devastation in the housing units. There were some houses some units that were burned to the ground. All of them I saw bullet holes, and that is not something I see in my everyday life, a bullet hole in a wall. There are bullet holes everywhere. I saw on the ground a child's toy. I saw the kind of little device that you would use, not device, but a little holding area where you would put clothes on it to dry it out outside. And those are signs of domesticity that existed in this kibbutz before the morning of October 7th. I'm told that there was significant loss of life, people murdered that day in that kibbutz, civilians living their lives, who found that at their doorstep came a person whose mission was to kill them. There was no discussion, there was nothing else. It was a mowing down of individual human beings. This is what began what we're dealing with now. There have been other issues that people reference over a long period of time. Ever since Israel was created in 1948, there's been an animosity between Israel, a Jewish state, and its neighboring states, which really do not want Israel there. There's been peace over the years. There's been some negotiations after some of the wars. Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt had gotten to some degree of peace, but those pieces that peace was paid a high price. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, assassinated, and Anwar Sadat was assassinated. The factor of death exists in the Middle East at every turn. While we were walking through the kibbutz, and we were just walking, we had on protective vests. I've never actually worn a bulletproof vest before, and I had as we were walking through with the other members of the delegation. I heard over my head a loud bang! And I've seen more than one 4th of July fireworks situation, but usually there's a beautiful, pretty light and lots of those little pops and bangs. It was a singular bang. As I looked up at it, and there's a group of us who were kind of walking around individually, I looked over at the person who was the individual who was at the kibbutz, and I looked at them. We said no words. I looked at his eyes, he looked at my eyes. And what I was looking at him was saying, was that an incoming missile? And was that an Iron Dome anti-missile missile that intercepted it and created that bang? And his eyes told me, yes. You've just seen what it's like to see an incoming missile in a place where you're walking. I've had many of my friends talk to me before my trip, and very happy to see me back after my trip, and to the other members of the delegation. And we thought about these things because we were going into a zone where there was conflict and war. Although while we were there there was the humanitarian pause that came from a period of time in which Hamas released a certain number of hostages and Israel released a certain number of prisoners that they had held. In the hostage release, women and children, I think some seniors were also released. The Palestinians that were released were people that were held in Israeli jails, and they were men. They were men who went back over to do whatever they will do now as part of the Hamas situation. Hamas was insistent upon not releasing any men who, in theory, might go back into the military on the Israeli side. So it was an exchange of individuals, an uneven exchange in terms of numbers. Far more Palestinians were released back to Gaza than were hostages released back to Israel. But nonetheless, we're appreciative that lives were saved, lives were not lost. We came back from Israel early in the morning, and we had some people to drop off throughout Westchester as we made our progression back here to White Plains, where most of the rest of us had parked. And as we were in some bumper-to-bumper traffic jam going through Mamaroneck, it was school time and people going to school, the natural tendency of us as Americans to be irritated over every little thing came to pass. Here's a long line, 15 cars up to the light, 2 cycles, we haven't really moved much. And then I thought to myself as I looked to the sky, it's the exact same sky that I saw over Kibbutz Kfar Aza. The difference is what irritated me, and perhaps the other people on Myrtle Boulevard as we were going 1-to-1-to-1 leading up to the traffic light at Weaver Street, was pretty minimal in comparison to what the people in the Middle East are frustrated by. When they look to the sky, they don't see rain that could ruin my Sunday. They see the potential of a missile strike that could end my life. This is what much of the world is like. And I don't purport to have a George Latimer plan for peace, but I do understand how lucky we are, how fortunate you and I are. And as I've just reached my 70th birthday, I'm rather happy that I've lived this long. I would rather be 35, who wouldn't? But I'm happy that I've survived this long. I hope to continue to survive and do whatever I'm going to do in a productive way. But I realize how fortunate we all are and how angry a society we've become, how willing we are to treat each other as the other, how willing we are to defriend each other on Facebook, how willing we are to take extreme positions and argue them to the point of physical altercation. There are people out there who look forward to some type of civil action in the United States between those who hold one set of views and those who hold another set of views. And there are extremists on both ends that are prepared to say democracy should disappear if it stands in the way of me imposing the vision that I have for this society. While I was in Israel, I had the chance to walk through Yad Vashem, which is the museum that is set aside to study the Holocaust. And by circumstance, because I'd been in Washington, D.C. the week before, I had a chance to walk through the Holocaust Museum. And that is horrific. There's no way to describe what the Holocaust was in the systematic extermination of the Jewish people in Europe under the hand of Hitler. That's why I say you use the word genocide. Be very careful what you're saying, because what genocide was gas chambers and people who were herded into a building for the purpose of being killed. That was what that genocide was. It wasn't a war, that it was a systematic extermination of civilians within the society that you governed. Hitler came to power through small d democratic means. The rules of Germany governed how he was picked to be chancellor, and within 1 month of his becoming chancellor, the Reichstag, which is the equivalent of the Congress, burned. And so the legislature could not meet. And they gave, in that moment, extraordinary executive powers to Hitler, which he used. Within the 2nd month of his leadership of Nazi Germany, he began the process of boycotting Jewish businesses. And in 1933, it ultimately led to Kristallnacht in 1938, and it led to the opening of concentration camps, which they called the final solution. Hitler wrote about these things in Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf was written in the 1920s when he was imprisoned, briefly, for what he had done in Munich. And he laid it out in Mein Kampf. There was no ambiguity about how he felt, and it was clear for everybody to see. He came to power, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. Exactly what he said he was going to do. He was finally stopped by the Allies, by the United States and Canada and Britain, and by Russia, which finally had to stop. And in the process of stopping the German war machine, there were many innocent civilians that died. There were many innocent civilians on the side of the Allies that died, and there were innocent civilians who were residents of Axis countries who were not the leaders of Axis countries. They were not the ones determining Göring and Himmler and Goebbels as the direction of the country. They were people who live like we live. They come, they go, they raise their family, they want to have a meal, they want to celebrate a birth, and they want to mourn a death in their family. And they lost their lives as it took the American allies to move across Europe from Normandy to Berlin, and as it took the Russians to move from almost being beaten by the Germans right outside of Moscow all the way into Berlin. 12 years. Hatred took hold of Germany and caused deaths in Germany and outside of Germany. I have a bachelor's degree in history. That does not make me an historian, but it makes me a student of history. And what I read is that history will repeat itself if people do not understand the lessons that it teaches us. What I realized returning back to the United States of America is we have a fabulous country, a free country where you are free to say what you want with the obligation that it should be true, but not the requirement that it be true, and that you have the right to associate or disassociate with whoever you want. That's freedom. You have the right to vote for a person or not vote for a person. That's freedom. But those tools were used in Nazi Germany to subjugate the people under an ironclad ruler. And that ironclad ruler destroyed human beings' lives, millions of them. I came back from my visit to the Middle East, and I'm fortunate for that. I did have a chance to see some of the sites that are holy to me as a Christian. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus is buried. The current version, because Jerusalem was devastated in ancient times and rebuilt, so it's not the actual old city of Jerusalem, even though it looks old to us, it's about 500 years old. It's not the actual city at the time, but we walked through the Via Dolorosa, which is the Way of Sorrows, and where they have Stations of the Cross. Those of us who are Roman Catholic, during Lent, we'll go to Stations of the Cross. There's 14 stations, and it talks about the path of Jesus from the point up to crucifixion, which is sacred to those of us who are Christian. And I walked through those streets, symbolic of what that meant. There's a lot to think about when you come back from Israel. It's not, going to the Mediterranean and looking out over the water. It's not, I had a marvelous dinner in Tel Aviv. I went down to the Dead Sea and I put some mud on my face to, beautify myself. Those things are not happening in Israel right now. There's a sadness in that country. There's no jingoist spirit. We've seen that spirit at other times in the United States when we've been attacked. Let's go out and get those guys. Let's show them a lesson. We didn't feel any of that. I didn't feel any of it. My colleagues, as we talked about it, didn't feel any of that. There is a resignation that this is a very serious moment and things are in the balance. And I come back stateside to know that there are protests at the Christmas tree lighting in Rockefeller Center. There's a protest at the Brooklyn Bridge or in Grand Central Station that shuts down those facilities because there are people that are protesting the United States' support of Israel. It's a very complicated situation. It's a very moving situation. It is important for us as county officials to do the things we're here to do. Ken and I are required, along with the legislators, to do the things that we're committed to do. We make buses free. We balance a budget. We get a good bond rating. We fix the infrastructure of the county. We work with mayors and supervisors to do the things we have to do. But all of that is under an iron dome of democracy that protects us. What if that iron dome fails? What if through the small d democratic process, we wind up with a totalitarian leadership that is prepared to do away with democracy? I saw that in Yad Vashem, repeated from the Holocaust Museum. There's a lot to think about. I've got a lot to think about. You've got a lot to think about. And now as we close this conference, you have time to think about it. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.